Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Allie Gold-Roberts, Director of the Ceres State Policy Program and the moderator for today's live stream Ceres 2020 event, State Leadership Amidst the Climate Crisis, Innovations and Collaborations. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world on a host of global sustainability challenges, including climate change. I would like to start today by recognizing this challenging time. Our hearts go out to all those who have been affected by this global pandemic, and we hope you and your loved ones are staying healthy and safe. I also want to thank our speakers and sponsors who have stood by us on this digital journey to reimagine Ceres 2020. We would not be here today without your support. Thank you all for tuning in. Today's session focuses on state leadership on climate change. As we've seen time and again with the COVID crisis, states across the country are stepping up to tackle the pandemic head on and lead their constituents out of the darkness. Many of these same states are leading the way in addressing another pending economic and public health crisis, climate change. As you'll hear from today's speakers, leading states are developing innovative solutions, learning from each other, and working collectively to reduce GHG emissions and scale up clean energy and clean transportation investments. Before we begin with today's session, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this session is being recorded, and we will provide all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the chat box that is located on your control panel. We will do our very best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Finally, please note that there is a potential due to global bandwidth issues, we may experience some challenges, fingers crossed. Unfortunately, this is totally beyond our control, and if it does happen, the discussion will hopefully only pause for a few seconds, allow for the bandwidth to readjust, and we will continue on. Ceres has the great pleasure of working with all of today's speakers on through our state policy program. Ceres is currently engaged in advocacy in 17 states across the country, where we work to deliver the voice of companies and investors in support of progressive climate policies. I am thrilled to say that all of the state's leaders on today's call have been on the receiving end of Ceres advocacy work, and we have been thrilled to partner with all of these states to increase ambition and work to develop innovative proposals to tackle the challenge of climate change. So now I will introduce our panelists. We'll start with Chris Bass, the Chief Deputy of the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, where he provides expert advice and strategic communications support to the Northam administration on transportation decarbonization, environmental justice, and building policy support for strong climate action. Prior to moving back to his home state, Chris spent 8 years at the forefront of climate and clean energy policy in the Pacific Northwest, and we even got to work with him back then. Julie Cerqueira is the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Alliance, where she helps advance climate and clean energy policy priorities of the Alliance's 25 governors and their offices. She previously served as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State, where she led U.S. engagement in strategic partnerships. Julie brings extensive insight on climate protection strategies at the national and international levels. Marty Suberg is the Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, serving under Governor Charlie Baker, and the current chair of RGGI Inc. Having worked for over 30 years in environmental and natural resource agencies at both the state and federal level, Marty is an experienced strategist in the implementation of environmental laws that protect the quality of life for all Massachusetts citizens. And Zach Pierce serves as Special Advisor on Climate and Energy for Colorado Governor Jared Polis. Previously, Zach worked on the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, where he focused on electric sector regulatory and legislative engagement in Colorado and New Mexico, as well as broader Western decarbonization strategy. He served in Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper's administration as well. So big thank you to our speakers for joining us today. And I'm sorry we're not all in person. We'll start by just acknowledging COVID-19 and how this epidemic has been affecting your work on climate change and the economy of your state and how you're thinking about climate policy. And maybe let's start with you, Chris.
Sure, thank you, Allie, and thank you everybody for joining and adapting to the new reality here, and one that I think that we're all slowly getting used to a little bit, trying to do all of these things. I've definitely spent much more time on camera than I have ever really, I think. So that's certainly been one adjustment. Staring at yourself while you talk. You know, it definitely has been an adjustment for everybody. You know, I'll just mention a few things. We were really in Virginia rocking and rolling on our transition to clean energy leadership. Had a great General Assembly session where, you know, we passed a 100% clean bill. We officially have legislation now to join RGGI and have been moving forward. And of course, now it's a little bit harder to get people's attention. So I think one area that's really affected us is just our internal work is slowed down a little bit as we sort of rightfully respect the fact that the governor's office and all of state government has kind of pivoted and transitioned to addressing the challenge. And that's certainly an understandable thing that we're dealing with within our agency. You know, transitioning an 800-person agency to one that is working 95% virtually certainly has its challenges as well. But you know, I've been proud of the way the agency has responded, and for us, having a doctor as governor has been something that has given us some comfort. And certainly has helped me sort of in my own handling of the situation. And I think that globally, we've really seen, I think, the benefit of our federalist system of government. I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit as well, but I think the response across the country has shown the importance of having governors to be able to stand up and fill the gaps, perhaps where federal leadership has not been what it ought to be, and that's a benefit of our system and one that we should all be proud of.
Great. How about you, Zach?
Thanks, Allie, and thanks to the full Ceres team for moving this conversation forward digitally. I was reflecting on it was still a really tough call as to whether or not to hold this conference in person in New York, and a lot has changed since then. You know, Colorado, like every state in the U.S., is no exception to seeing substantive impacts from COVID. We've got over 18,000 cases, over 900 deaths in the state, and it's dramatically impacted our way of life. You know, in my world, similar to Massachusetts, we in Colorado, we're kind of full steam ahead on climate and clean energy policy, and had just kind of finished our most productive session in the state's history last year on climate and clean energy policy, and we're prepping for an equally ambitious agenda this year, and things really have changed. You know, it's hard to overstate the incoming challenge of budget shortfalls that we anticipate with our state's general fund. And you know, then there's the on-the-ground impact to the energy industry broadly. So whether that's local permitting for solar installation, obviously the pipeline flows for manufacturing, and then you know, we're still a large oil and gas producing state, seeing a lot of impacts there. Not to mention some of the considerations around critical infrastructure workforce and thinking through that transition for those key sectors of our economy as we experience stay-at-home orders, and then Colorado's transition to a more reopened phase. You know, there have been silver linings. I think, you know, we've been able to continue to proceed on a lot of our regulatory work, important work protecting clean air and some of the climate-related rules that we're moving on. And in some ways, we've seen even more engagement in our regulatory process due to everyone getting used to online and virtual engagement. You know, folks from our Western Slope who can more readily engage, and I hope we can carry some of that with us as we transition to a new normal for everyone. Another piece that came to mind for me was, you know, before COVID, we'd always looked at telecommuting as kind of a nice to have thing to talk about, but not really a huge tool in the toolbox. But as we look at the transition that's taken place over the last few months, certainly a global pandemic is not a climate strategy, but we look at the economic efficiency, quality of life, and the ability to conduct a fair amount of business with telecommuting, and we're looking at that tool a lot more seriously these days. You know, I'm very proud of Governor Polis and our administration's, mostly our communication team's efforts to try to be as transparent and thorough with the public, communicating the latest public health data, the epidemiological trends that we're tracking, and then how that translate into state guidance for some of our executive orders and public health orders. We're all in kind of uncharted territory together, and we've made a big effort to keep that open dialogue with the public. So all in all, this is a world filled with both challenges and opportunities, and we're trying to be as thoughtful and judicious with continuing with climate priorities as we move forward.
Great, Zach. Marty.
I'll join and thank you, first of all, for persevering and putting on this session. And I offer my own wishes for everybody to stay healthy, stay well, stay safe. In Massachusetts, like my colleagues from the other states, COVID obviously is an area where we're spending a lot of time right now. Like other states, many of us in the Department of Environmental Protection are working remotely, but it's important to underscore that we are there. We are at work. We're continuing to move on things that are important, both related to COVID. We're spending a lot of time doing outreach to people that are trying to do the right thing and trying to balance the challenges of COVID while still meeting the public health and environment challenges that they need to meet in operations. So we're dealing with regulated communities. We're dealing with groups that are interested in our natural resources. We're trying to make sure that we are being thoughtful about how our workforce is interacting with people when they are out in the field themselves. In addition to that, we are trying to keep a lot of things that were front and center before COVID moving. My boss, Secretary of Energy and Environment, Katie Theorides, only a few weeks ago published a roadmap to help design how we're going to meet our 2050 goals for carbon pollution reduction under our Global Warming Solutions Act. You'll hear more about some of the other work we're doing on regional efforts. We are continuing to make sure that policies that we're in the process of development, regulations that we are thinking about, continue to move forward, even if we need to be thoughtful and adjust our timeframes because of the challenges of COVID. But nevertheless, it's important. These were important public health and environment issues before COVID. They're important now. They will be important even as we move forward. So we're continuing to try to be our most nimble and flexible as we develop these strategies moving forward.
Perfect. And Marty, I'm sure we'll come back to you to hear more about that net zero plan for the Commonwealth and the recent progress here. So Julie, you get the honor of working with 25 states, and you're seeing this at a national level. Just at what are some of the trends you're seeing around continued commitment and interest from climate? Because unfortunately, the timeline for us to get to those 2030 targets has not changed. If anything, the urgency for action is probably maybe increased as people think about the increased COVID cases with those communities that are at the front lines of emissions. So this is certainly an urgent topic for all of us.
Absolutely, and thank you for continuing to host us, and it's nice to get to see some friendly faces virtually, so glad to be on this terrific panel. First and foremost, I would just say that I'm incredibly proud of the leadership that our governors have shown. They have been decisive, transparent, science-driven in their approach to the emergency response. And I think that that very much mirrors the approach that they have taken in responding to climate change. We see a thirst for that across the country. And so I'm, again, incredibly proud that they've been able to really take on that mantle of leadership. Are getting pulled into responding to COVID-19. The priority, of course, is to protect the health of their communities, while then also planning for the transition to the recovery. And so, the emergency both is a health one as much as it is an economic one, and trying to think on a day-to-day basis, what is the best thing for their communities. Many of the climate policies that we've heard about just now continue to be on track and are moving at pace. There are others that are also moving slowly or have been postponed, and so a number of the legislative sessions had to be dismissed early, which means that they didn't get through their entire docket. And then I think as we start to look at legislative sessions in the future, many of them will continue to have climate policies, but there's going to have to be a little bit of a shift in thinking what those priorities are, and they may not necessarily align with what we have seen in the past or just kind of going into the crisis. But the important thing is that they're also planning for the future. And what I've seen across the states is that they're really thinking about how do they build back better. So not just put in place the same policies that they had, the same economies, but really thinking about how do we use this as an opportunity to modernize, to decarbonize, and to enhance the resilience of our critical infrastructure, which will be essential not only for climate, but essential for us to actually continue to be a competitive economy. We've seen that other countries like China are making major investments in their infrastructure in order to be highly competitive. We want to make sure that we continue to at least match that. And then second is also looking at creating pathways and opportunities for family sustaining jobs. I think one thing that has become very transparent with this pandemic is that we don't have the systems in place necessarily for especially those most vulnerable who are on the front lines. We've got grocery workers, people who are driving buses and operating mass transit who don't have a lot of protections. And so I think it's really stirred up a lot of questions around the workforce. And it's not just about the quantity of jobs, but making sure the quality of jobs is there as well. I think to your point on silver lining, I think the thing that has emerged out of here is just reinforcing the spirit of cooperation. So I've been so impressed to see how these 25 states have worked so well together, and this has just really strengthened that resolve for cooperation, as we've seen even in kind of coordinating the way that they're going to reopen their economies. And I think it's also just been an opportunity for them to, again, think about where do we want to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and how do we make sure that as we're making the investments in the future and focusing on the recovery, that we're moving towards a more optimistic vision than I think a lot of us are experiencing right now.
Thanks, Julie. And that was really the theme and spirit of this session that we had envisioned long before COVID when we were hoping to be together in person. I have the great pleasure of getting to see how our team works in states across the country, and the collaboration that we've seen, but also the innovation and lessons learned and sharing across state lines is essential to the success that we've seen in reducing emissions. So with that, I'd love to talk about the innovative climate approaches or multi-state collaborations, or both, that each of you feel like you want to highlight that your state has done or been a part of that are kind of on the front lines of how we tackle climate change. And I'll start with Zach and the incredible work that you guys have done around transportation in the most recent time, but also some of the other things that you're working on.
Thanks, Allie. Yeah, so Governor Polis, from the outset of his campaign, was very focused on climate and clean energy policy, specifically with a targeted goal of 100% renewable energy by 2040. And while the initial focus was renewables, and certainly we still see renewables as really the tip of the spear of our climate strategy, quickly the focus expanded to emissions reductions across the economy, and that included a large focus on transportation. So in Colorado under Governor Hickenlooper, we adopted the LEV standards in 2018, and then Governor Polis's first executive order was focused on transportation electrification, and initiated, among other things, a process to examine a ZEV rule for the state. And in August of 2019, that culminated in Colorado becoming the 10th state in the nation, first in a decade, to adopt the ZEV standard. And I think one of the unique characteristics of the Colorado process was that standard was supported by over 99% of automobile manufacturers, and some unique aspects that included allowing for proportional and early action credits, and other supportive policies and investments that the state has made to work both on the model availability in an expedited manner that kind of tracks with federal tax credits, as well as the infrastructure side of things. So, we targeted the remainder of our VW settlement funds for electric vehicle infrastructure, mid to heavy duty vehicles, and continue to really see transportation electrification and zero emission vehicles in the transportation sector as a critical tool. Colorado still has the electricity sector as the leading contributor to emissions, but we expect to follow the national trend within the next year or two and have transportation become the number one contributor. And it's also not only a carbon challenge, but very relevant for local air pollution. So when we look at non-attainment for ozone standards on the Front Range in Colorado, where a number of our urban areas are, we look at the transportation sector and the oil and gas industry as the two top contributors to the precursors of ozone pollution. Another regional effort that we have been engaged in is the Rev West Memorandum of Understanding. So that's the regional electric vehicle plan for the West, signed by governors of 8 Western states in 2017. And this effort really had a goal of aligning each state's electric vehicle plans, policies, and investments to allow for seamless travel across the Intermountain region. So whether you're on a road trip with your family traveling through national parks in the West or other activity, we wanted to make sure that we were supporting a dialogue around continued coordination and finding those areas where that consistency was really important on a number of fronts. That group's done a number of things, completed a baseline report on existing policies and infrastructure, developed voluntary minimum standards for electric vehicle stations funded with state dollars, and further coordinated build out of charging infrastructure. And I'll also note that the MOU itself was recommitted to just last year at the Western Governors Association. We've seen a fair amount of turnover, but I think it's a great indication of the kind of new wave of governors maintaining that commitment to coordinated efforts around EV charging infrastructure and electric vehicle policy. Switching back to the electric sector, another area that really requires multi-state coordination is the conversation of wholesale electricity markets, or just more market coordination generally. The West is unique in the sense that many of the states and electric utilities in the Rocky Mountain region are not part of an organized market, and we're still comprised of a number of balancing authorities and bilateral contracts between utilities. And as we see more and more both states and electric utilities committing to ambitious emission reductions, ambitious RPS standards, the Polis administration certainly has identified continued dialogue and advancement of regional coordination as kind of a critical precursor to achieving those long-term goals, whether it's reducing capacity reserve margins, coordination on transmission investment, more geographic and spatial diversity on different renewable resources. We need to continue to think through what that coordination looks like. And it's not an easy proposition to have a coordinated conversation among numerous governor's offices, numerous utilities, numerous public utilities commissions, but I'm encouraged. I think there's building momentum around a Western regional conversation with governors and utilities to think through not only the benefits, but some of the mechanisms and pathways that states could take to achieve mutual goals. So those are 3 specific examples. I'll note that Colorado last year signed into law a number of bills. The story of our past legislative session was really the sum of all the parts of about 14 pieces of legislation, but we have set economy-wide emissions reductions targets. Like I said, we are still elevating renewables and the value proposition of what we can do with the electric sector as the tip of the spear, but we're quickly pivoting and augmenting with extending the impact of that clean electricity across the economy, and thinking about beneficial electrification and a number of other fronts. So the regional piece is critical, and those are a few examples of where we're spending our time in Colorado.
Thanks, Zach. And I think it gives us all hope that you guys are looking at multiple sectors of the economy and how we decarbonize, that it can't just be one. But also the work that you guys have done on the Lev and Zev rulemaking. Our friends up north in Minnesota are now trying to replicate your success. So great lessons learned out of your team's work that another state is trying to implement as we speak. So on the transportation theme, I'll go to Marty to talk a little bit both about the Transportation Climate Initiative, but also other work that Massachusetts has been part of regionally, whether that's the EV charging corridor, but then also obviously on the electric power side. Marty also is chair of RGGI Inc. And certainly we are thrilled to have had Chris and the team in Virginia officially join RGGI, so a new state in the club. So I'll kick it over to you, Marty, and then Chris, you'll go next.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we are a state that is working on a number of fronts, and we work under the authority of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which sets goals and requires us to continue to be making progress. And as you noted, it's more than just one sector. We also are very much guided by the direction our governor has set for us. It started in 2016 with an executive order that had us working on both the vulnerability resilience side as well as mitigation. And on the resilience side, our secretary designed a very important program to make sure that we are talking about the impacts of climate change and working with communities that are going to be living with the impacts of climate change. They designed the Municipal Vulnerability Program, which is a program that has taken root all over state to help communities plan for the impacts and then develop courses of action and then help them take the steps they need to take for resiliency. And so there's been ongoing work in that area on the resiliency side. On mitigation, we have looked at a number of sectors, and as noted just this past few weeks, well, really a little earlier than that, our governor announced a net zero goal in his State of the State address at the beginning of 2020. Our secretary has started work on a roadmap to help us meet our 2050 goals and all the goals we need to meet along the way. The process we're using is the process of quantitative measurement, a broad stakeholder engagement through a number of groups to make sure that we are measuring what we need to measure effectively and that we are taking action in a coordinated manner. And so that work is ongoing. You noted that this year I have the privilege of being the chairman of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiatives, which deals with the power sector. And that's an important sector for us in Massachusetts. We have been a member of RGGI for over a decade, and we, like the other states, have really seen the benefits of coordinated state action. We have seen carbon pollution decline by half since 2005 in our region, which is a faster rate of decline than the rest of the country. We have seen the benefits of this program by over $3 billion in proceeds, a large majority of that going into clean energy and energy efficiency, which in turn saves consumers money, over $1 billion in savings to consumers on energy costs. It is an approach that has been very much consensus-based. It has been bipartisan. Right now, it is a mix of administrations. We have 10 states. In addition to the good news about Virginia, which Chris will talk about in a moment, we were delighted to have New Jersey rejoin RGGI this year and are participating in what has been over 47 auctions that have auctioned over 1 billion allowances. That is the engine of this program, all while maintaining a commitment to program review and to making sure that we are continuing to evaluate how well the program works and where the opportunities are to improve it. So we have been continuing that work. Not only with Virginia, we're obviously also interested to see the work that Pennsylvania is doing, and are continuing to monitor that. But like our colleagues in the other states, transportation is the next area where we want to make sure that we are making improvements. Because while we've made progress with the power sector, like the other states, transportation accounts for 40% of our emissions of greenhouse gases. They have been stubborn, they have been rising. We need to take action to address greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. And early on, I think we recognized, thanks to some facilitated discussions that our colleagues at Georgetown University helped organize, that this is another opportunity for regional action. And so we have been in the past year, really now the past 18 months, working in earnest with states in the New England and Mid-Atlantic areas to see if we can design a program that has the same kind of success and the same kind of market-based approach that made RGGI work in the transportation sector. And so we have been working on the Transportation Climate Initiative. And our Secretary Theorides is one of the co-chairs. What's interesting about this initiative is, again, it brings different parts of government together, not only other states, but as in RGGI, we were working with our energy departments and public utility commissions. The Transportation Climate Initiative, we're working with our transportation colleagues because we're getting benefits not only in a program like this with pollution reduction, we're also dealing with some of the other issues that we hear about when we talk about transportation, congestion, public transit, meaningful options for people to have clean sources of transportation. And so this past year, as many of you know, and Ceres has been particularly helpful in terms of weighing in, urging us to take action, urging us to be transparent and inclusive in our discussions. These states issued a draft Memorandum of Understanding at the end of 2019, along with modeling data that would show the economics of how a program like the Transportation Climate Initiative would work. What are the costs, and as importantly, what are the benefits? What are the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas reduction? What are the public health benefits? What are the economic benefits, like we've seen with the RGGI models? So we asked the public to take a look at those materials. Those materials were developed following extensive deliberations by the states, as well as extensive outreach, both in individual states and throughout the region. We've been looking at the comments we received. Thankfully, we received robust public comment. We are continuing to analyze those comments, continuing to do modeling work. As Chris acknowledged in his opening statement, obviously COVID affects timing on a lot of things. We realize that a lot of people are focused on COVID, but there are some of us that are continuing to work. We are continuing to meet virtually. We are continuing to do analytical and technical work. And I think that work will continue. And so we will be continuing to hope to make progress on TCI. I think we'll have more to say about the schedule in the weeks ahead as people have a chance to both deal with COVID and the other things that people are reacting to right now. But again, that's been a very important part of our efforts to deal with transportation emissions in the Commonwealth and in the region.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I feel like we've teed you up perfectly to talk about RGGI, but I feel like that is not even, that's like just the beginning of the wins that you guys got. So I'll let you, I'll just be the teaser and let you tell folks about everything great that just recently happened in Virginia.
Sure, thank you. And I don't know if I can do everything great, but two great things that we can really emphasize here and that happened in the past couple months. And I of course, have mentioned both of them previously briefly, and one is the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which put into law our 100% clean energy goal for the state to decarbonize the electricity grid by mid-century. and then of course Reggie. And the story there that I think is important to leave folks with is the same way that Marty was talking about the sort of intergovernment coordination that has to happen for some of these programs, even the ones where we are regionally collaborative. Our story with both of those programs is really a multiple branches of government. We all, and even Julie to some extent, work for governors here. And certainly a lot of this doesn't happen without the executive branch leadership, but our story shows that you also really need your legislature to be with you to push a lot of these things into a good position. And so that story for Reggie starts a couple years ago in the previous administration under Governor McAuliffe, where we were working hard on the Clean Power Plan, and the sort of Clean Power Plan drama happened, and Governor McAuliffe didn't want us to be pens down and said, hey, we have to continue to figure this out. We have to figure out our path forward for decarbonizing the power sector. What do you got? And so we had some good experience working with some folks who were in Reggie and looking towards Maryland's experience and our neighbors to the north. And so Reggie was identified as, hey, here's a path forward for us. And we had an approach that we needed to take because we didn't have legislative authority to fully participate in the auction. So we had a unique workaround that we were working through, and thankfully we were able to pass legislation this year to enable us to officially join Reggie and participate as a full participant in the auction. And one of the problems that solved was last year's session, we had actually a budget amendment that was sort of a poison pill that prohibited us, even with our unique regulatory workaround, prohibited us from spending any money in sort of advancing Reggie. And so there was an intervening election that was incredibly important. And now we were in a position where the legislature was able to solve that problem for us. And not only were they able to solve that problem for us, but we were able to pass the 100% Clean Bill, the Virginia Clean Economy Act too. And the executive legislative story there is the Governor Northam in September of 2019 issued an executive order establishing the 100% clean goal. And so we were, like a number of states, I think the number now is in the teens, were the latest to have a 100% clean goal in either law or order. In our case, it was an executive order, and it put some requirements on state agencies to establish some pathways for how we get there, and really set out the vision for Virginia's energy future. That was in September. Again, we had an intervening election in November, and then in January and February, we're able to actually take that vision that was established in that executive order and turn it into a piece of legislation. So now we have a legally binding commitment for our power sector to decarbonize by mid-century, and are only the 6th state to do so, and importantly for us, the first in the South. And we're really proud of that, and think that's a good example of what happens when you have an executive branch and a legislative branch that are on the same page on this.
Awesome. Well, I'm so disappointed that somehow we only have 20 minutes left, and I have so many more questions, and also the questions are pouring in. So to the audience, keep the questions coming, and we can always email the speakers afterwards. But Julie, I think one of the things we clearly know from all of these states is that the collaboration is really key. And Chris, I'm gonna out a secret you told me, which was that Julie and the U.S. Climate Alliance have been so helpful, which is, I don't think, a big secret or surprise. But having the support of other states, being able to share lessons learned, but also there are some states who have very small climate staff, or may not even have a staff that's called climate. So having the resources of the U.S. Climate Alliance is deeply essential. So I would love to get a sense of just the benefits of sharing and that kind of innovative approach. But also, I think as we look at challenges and inaction at the federal level, how states collaborating are going to work together to ultimately meet some of the challenges that we're seeing in Washington as well.
Great. And I just want the audience to know that I am equally surprised by how wonderful of an introduction that was. So thank you for that. That's terrific. So we didn't touch on a couple of other sectors that I think have been really important for the Alliance states. I won't go into a lot of detail because I know that we're running out of time, but I did just want to mention a couple that are sort of my favorite. One of which is just our work on hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. And so this to me has just been such a great model for how we're seeing other policies across the country be replicated by the states. It's one of the few places where you have industry, environmental groups, states, all on the same page about what the solutions should be. And so the states have been working together to put in place substantially similar policies that would avoid a patchwork regulatory framework, and they're working with industry to make sure that that is created in such a way that it makes it easier for them to comply. We also have this incredible moment where there is a global transition happening due to the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on HFCs as well. And so it's an opportunity for the states to work with industry who, in the United States are really the leading innovators of HFC alternatives and technologies. And so it's an opportunity for us to help them get a competitive edge in this global transition, to build a stronger workforce, and to really provide those higher quality and low cost products to consumers. What we're also seeing is some movement finally in Congress, potentially on some new legislation that would provide complementary regulation to what the states are already putting in place. And so you're seeing sort of this collaboration across groups, a market that's being driven by the states, and now the federal government starting to kind of follow the leadership of the states. And I think because of that, it's been one of the places where we've had the most success. And so when I see this innovation at the state level, it's not just on the specific policies, but it's on this kind of lateral coordination, and then kind of inspiring the federal government to also put in place kind of similar rules. I would say, to your question on just kind of some of the benefits, for example, of this collaboration, as I mentioned, I think first and foremost, it's just avoiding a patchwork regulatory framework where you can, and that makes it easier for both industry and consumers to navigate those markets. In addition to that, I think it's pretty clear that, especially for some of the smaller states, they can't always just regulate on their own. It's easy for them to get boxed out of the market. And by the states working together, you're able to really create a much larger single market that creates demand for higher quality products, right? And so that to me is where some of the biggest strengths of this alliance have been. There's also a lot of cost efficiencies. So I would think about the cost efficiencies both in terms of like the reduced time for formulating strategies. And so it's been inspiring to see so many of the states learn from each other. So you'll have one or two go forward, and then once the others see that that's possible, that they can tackle the opposition, they can work together on implementation of those solutions, it makes it much easier for others to follow. And so, I think Zach and others were talking about like 100% clean energy goals. If you think about even just like 2 years ago, that just seemed like a dream, right? It just seems so far-fetched. And now we have, I think, maybe 8 or 9 that have 100% clean energy goals in legislation, and another 11 or so that have proposed that either through executive order or through other administrative action. And so, it's that pace of change is just accelerated through the cooperation and through the shared learning. And then finally, it's just a way for them to also leverage their collective markets and their collective purchasing power. So this group of states together represents 60% of the US economy. So that's an $11.7 trillion economy. And so when they work together, there's the potential for them to really have a transformative impact in the US.
Awesome. Well, one of the other pieces that I think is a perfect segue to this, and I see that some of the companies and investors who are on the line who have engaged in advocacy on some of the topics that we've talked about, but how does this multi-state collaboration create certainty also for the private sector? And Julie, I think you started to answer this question, but maybe Zach, for you, in thinking about how you worked with the automakers, or Chris, how you worked with the data center companies who want to procure renewables in Virginia, as just maybe some examples. So Zach, I'll go to you first.
Thanks, Allie. Yeah, it's a great question. And I also want to just give a shout out to Julie and her team at the U.S. Climate Alliance, because they have been such amazing connective tissue between the states moving towards shared goals. And of course, whether it's electric vehicle policy, or what we're doing with state procurement, or coordination on, you name the issue. Of course, if you have multiple states paddling in the same direction, or thinking about the same kind of regulatory or policy framework, the collective impact of that in the market is much more powerful. And I think in the absence of real federal leadership in this space, it's been a real bright spot to have that, convening power of the Climate Alliance, and allow states to think about those most powerful opportunities to leverage the shared economic impact of policymaking. So, with the clean car standards, or let's just say transportation policy broadly, whether it's coordination on the framework of a ZEV rule, obviously that's a kind of a discrete lane that you can operate within that space, but thinking about transportation policy more broadly, and next iterations of clean car standards, I think, this is going to be a really important conversation, and thinking through the leverage, or the leverage that we have with collective market impact between states is going to be critical.
Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and jump in. I think that a couple of things there. One, like lots of states, we share a major metropolitan area with several different jurisdictions, several metropolitan areas, and so it's important to have these collaborations just for ease of doing business. One thing in Virginia that we always pride ourselves on is being near the top, if not at the very top, of the various rankings for the best state to do business, and we want that to really specifically highlight, the best state to do business when it comes to clean energy companies, or when it comes to companies like your bicep companies that have really strong sustainability goals. And on that piece for us, one thing that we've seen in Virginia, we've gone through this really rapid transformation of our politics, our demographics, and sort of the expectations of what Virginians sort of they have for the role government plays, which means that now legislators and the executive branch are catching up to what those expectations are. But that means we need a lot of help, both at the executive branch level, also at our utility commission. And that's one area where we have seen corporate involvement at the commission level to really help raise the level of understanding on different regulatory frameworks, how they work, and being able to have businesses who have experience working in other jurisdictions that have successfully applied different types of regulatory schemes to incentivize clean energy deployment, make it easier for companies to meet those goals. That's been really, really helpful. So in Virginia, that type of engagement from Ceres companies and from the companies themselves, and not just from the trade associations, is really crucial.
Awesome. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go to some of the questions that have come in, and then we'll see how much time we have for those. But I guess this is probably both for Zach and Julie, but maybe also for you, Marty, of who comes to ask for your advice about RGGI. Is there any potential for a market model similar to RGGI in the Intermountain West or Southwest Interior? Building off of the conversations that are happening with governors out west, Zach. Maybe we'll kick it to you first, but anyone can answer.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it was Marty that mentioned Massachusetts recently finalized a roadmap of sorts to kind of sketch out progress towards climate targets, and we're in the middle of the same process in Colorado. Thinking through both the impact of policies that we have on the books. We're in the midst of kind of refining our inventory as a precursor to any of this work, our greenhouse gas inventory, and then starting to look at that wedge analysis of how we're going to get there. And certainly, we are really focused on a number of targeted sector-specific strategies. We see huge opportunity in the near term. When we look at specific sectors like transportation and electricity, but of course soon, the conversation includes market-based mechanisms and some, carbon pricing and all of that. And it's something we're certainly actively looking at. I don't think it's our perception that it's an either or, and that at the end of the day, if you look at any, either state or national framework, that's a kind of an amalgamation of a number of policies that may include carbon pricing, and we don't want to presume to know what the ideal policy proposal of 2030 or 2050 looks like. So we're trying to take a thoughtful approach to looking at some different options there. And I do think, building on some of the framework that has been built around collaboration in the West on whether it's electricity markets or transportation policy, we have a lot of those institutions in place and lines of communication in place to think about what's next. And, certainly I think it's our governor's perspective that at some point we're going to need national leadership in this space, and that's really where you're going to see real action. But in the absence of that, we're very interested in continued dialogue with our partner Western states to think through additional opportunities to collaborate.
Anybody else want to take a stab? Go ahead, Julie. Oh, Julie, you got to unmute, I think.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
Sorry.
Great.
Go ahead.
So I think we've heard a number of states actually that are interested in market mechanisms broadly that could include expanding RGGI on the East Coast or exploring something that is more economy-wide like you see in California. But it also could be specific to things like a low carbon fuel standard, for example, or other mechanisms. So I think the key thing though is that, kind of similar to what Zach is saying, those market mechanisms are complementary to regulations and not intended to in some way displace them, but it is certainly an opportunity that a number are interested in.
Awesome. Well, I realize I think we only have time for one more question, and somehow that flew by really, really fast. So we'll do like a 30-second to 60-second answer to the following question. We'll try and get to everybody. Just like dream collaboration between states, building off of things you've already done or things you want to see states join you doing. If you could wave a wand, magic policy. And for the speakers, this question was not prepared ahead of time, so now I'm asking them to answer very short. So surprise question, but think about like the dream policy that you'd like to see people join you doing, or you would like to put in place kind of moving forward, and it could be for any sector. And I will start with Marty.
Well, I'm going to give probably an answer that doesn't focus on a particular policy, but it dovetails a little bit into the last answers. I think the strength of regional collaboration that we've seen in RGGI and what we're hoping to accomplish in the transportation sector with TCI, there are a couple of things, first of all, going on. You get the benefits of regional action that some of our other panelists have talked about. And in transportation, we've all seen that that's incredibly important, as states try to deal with this. But there's also a recognition that states, are going to be in the best position to decide what's really going to work in their states and in their communities, because states will have different communities with different needs. And so the ability to work on policies that are tailored to fit different community needs for different things is going to be really, really important. And I think that the ability to work collectively while still recognizing the individual is important. And again, a number of the speakers have said it. We will work together regionally on a particular approach, but the complementary policies, we've heard a lot about that in the TCI area. What else are we doing? How does this fit into a bigger, sustained, coordinated effort? And so for me, I think the opportunity to have those discussions and design processes that allow you to have individual and collective, this policy building on others is the real appeal of a regional effort.
Awesome. Zach?
Allie, you've given me such power with this question. I don't know where to focus. Just three quick things that I sketched down that I think are going to be really important to focus on. The U.S. Climate Alliance has played a critical role in convening member states to think about federal stimulus conversations and how we're really leveraging the clean energy sector as a real driving force in lasting and sustainable economic recovery and growth. So I think that's a big place to focus. I think another place where multi-state collaboration is critical is thinking through the just transition from a workforce and community standpoint as we think about moving from our incumbent energy system to a decarbonized system. And that may be, well, that's relevant for every state in different ways, but in Colorado, that's both for the oil and gas industry, for the coal industry. And then the third on my list would just be it's going to be critical to continue advancing the discussion around both market and infrastructure coordination in the electricity space. And so whether we're talking about new transmission investments and planning for that now, or whether we're talking about more market integration in a part of the country that still has largely vertically integrated utilities, I think those are kind of foundational to where we see our state being in the next decade.
Chris.
So I think I'll go back to one of the ways that I started, which was looking at our system of federalism and the ability that states have had on a number of issues to move national action, right? Which is going back to sort of first principles with Julie and the Climate Alliance was, in an era of a lack of federal leadership on climate, what can we do together? And so I think ultimately my magic wand is that similar to things like, marriage equality, for example, or we're seeing minimum wage policies across the country, that the states collected can move the national conversation to the point where we have a federal program that we're all participating in. And I think, looking for examples of that can kind of go to what Marty was saying about each state's own particular needs, and then to what Zach was saying about how we protect workers who are in legacy energy industries. A federal standard that allows states to meet how is best for them could be something that would be really great and a good way for us to collaborate to move the federal government towards that. In Virginia, we look at the Chesapeake Bay program in the water quality space as an example of that, where the EPA set a standard for nutrient loading in our streams and rivers, and then all of the Bay states, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, little slice of Delaware, all work together to meet that objective in our own way. And so I think to the extent that we can collectively work and change the nature of the conversation so that hopefully in the near future we have a federal program that we've all sort of built through our state action, that would be really fantastic.
Julie, final word, and I apologize, we're over.
I'll be super fast. So I don't have a specific policy. I just, we have 25 governors that are just doing something incredible. We should have 50. That is like my dream, right? Our governors have shown that they have reduced emissions twice as fast as the rest of the country while growing their per capita GDP 3 times as fast. That is evidence that economic growth and climate leadership go hand in hand, and I would invite the other 25 governors to follow them and to find ways to work with us.
Amen. That is a perfect way to end, Julie. So with that, there's a slide that's going to pop up really fast on the federal stimulus conversation. I just want to flag for those who are on the phone, Ceres is organizing our Lead on Climate 2020. This is our largest virtual lobby day on Capitol Hill next week. We already have, I think, 230 companies, small and large, who have RSVP'd, who are going to talk about building back better. And to your point, Zach, figuring out how do we use this stimulus moment as an opportunity to really invest in clean energy solutions. So we hope you all can join us in that for those companies and investors on the phone. Next slide, I just want to highlight that everyone will receive a recording of the session. A big thank you to our sponsors. And a final reminder that the next Ceres 2020 session is a CEO's perspective on transforming the electric power sector with Mauricio Gutierrez from NRG and our own CEO at Ceres, Mindy Luber, along with my colleague John Weiss from the company network. So a big, huge thank you to all of you for joining us. I wish I could hug you all, but that probably won't be permissible for a very long time. But thank you for joining us from your homes and this incredible discussion from those of you on the phone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.